I'm Kevin Anderson. I'm the Director of Youth and Family Faith Formation here at Love of Christ. I am also looking forward to my internship starting at Love of Christ Lutheran Church. And a part of those intern responsibilities are going to be regular preaching. So you get me for this coming Sunday, the 17th Sunday after Pentecost. And as is the tradition here at Love of Christ, the preaching pastor for the upcoming Sunday does a brief look at the Old Testament text and the gospel text for the coming Sunday. So for this Sunday, we're going to take a look at Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 38. And just some brief background on this text. Just a reminder that Mark is the earliest account that we have of Jesus. The date of the text is roughly 60 to 70 AD. And the Gospel of Mark can be broken into three sections. The first is we have Jesus in Galilee, and then we have this movement, or on the way, on the road to Jerusalem, and then lastly we have the story of Jesus in Jerusalem. Now what's interesting about the Gospel of Mark is the author kind of stays out of the way. And what I mean by that is the author doesn't really offer their own thoughts on Jesus, and instead presents the story of Jesus and people's reactions to Jesus. And we're left kind of challenged with this concept in the book of Mark. We are left to wrestle with our own understanding, with our own understanding of the story of Jesus. What do we do with this Messiah? How will we react? What will we say? What will we do? Will we be like others? Will we do something different than the accounts that we have here in the Gospel of Mark? So we're kind of left to wrestle at the end of Mark with how the gospel is presented. Now the gospel text for this morning is on the way to Jerusalem. It falls in that section. So we're kind of hearing the continued revelation of Jesus as Messiah. And you'll hear about this more in the text. Let's take a closer look at the gospel. Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 30. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he, Jesus, sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all of this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and with the holy angels." There's a lot going on in this text. There's probably 8, 9, 10 sermons that can be preached on this text alone. First, we have Peter's declaration of Jesus as Messiah. Peter makes this confession of faith when he says the truth about who Jesus is. Now, this is a very profound thing. Jesus' closest followers are starting to see who he is, even though they've seen these healings, these miracles that Jesus has performed thus far in Mark. They're still trying to figure out who Jesus is as the Messiah and as a person. How can this be? How can this be that Jesus is the chosen one, the Son of God? Now, a theme that's captured in Mark is called the Messianic secret, and we hear it in the text for this Sunday as Peter declares Jesus is the Messiah, but Jesus tells his disciples not to say who he is. We see this earlier in Mark chapter 1, and we see this again in Mark chapter 9 after the transfiguration, when Jesus tells Peter, James, and John not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Now, we're not sure exactly why there's this kind of secret. There's some theories out there as to why Jesus is telling his disciples to not say who he is. One of the more practical examples is that the news of Jesus coming out as Messiah might create some tension, some roadblocks for Jesus' continued path to the cross that he's announced is coming. And if everyone knows that he is the Messiah, he's going to be pulled in many, many, many different directions. What's interesting about this, however, is when we take a look at the other Gospels, there's much more announcement of who Jesus is. Now, this Messianic secret, could it be tied to the author staying out of the way, so to speak, and kind of continuing in this story of Jesus? And all of this accumulates in a declaration from an unexpected source towards the end of Mark's Gospel. And that is when the centurion declares that Jesus was truly the Son of God. So the pronouncement of Jesus as Messiah comes from an unexpected person. It's not from Jesus' closest followers that are telling everyone, but it's from someone who is outside of the circle, so to speak, who sees who God really is, who the Son of God really is. Now, the next kind of big tension we have here is the reality of the Messiah and Peter's rebuke. Peter's expectations for the Messiah do not align with who the Messiah really is. So Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah, and then Jesus tells them what that means, what's going to happen to him. And Peter says, no way. There's no way that you're the Messiah and that you're going to be rejected and then you're going to suffer and die and then rise again. That's not what the Messiah is here to do. The Messiah, for Peter and others, is thought of as a kind of prince or a king that was going to establish a new kingdom, a new ruling kingdom that was going to take care of Rome, the problem that is Rome, and that Israel would no longer suffer under Roman occupation. Well, Jesus is telling us that this isn't going to happen. And Peter rebukes him for this, because Peter has his own expectations, his own image of what God should be doing, and it doesn't align with the reality of who God is and what God does. This is a great question for all of us to wrestle with. Is Jesus the Messiah that we actually hope for? When we think about our own lives, when we think about the pain and the suffering that is real, when we think about how things have not gone the way that we have planned, or we see injustice in the world, or we see the tension, the turmoil, we maybe shake our fist at God a little bit. Maybe we are kind of like Peter, and we want to rebuke God because we do not get the life that we had planned to get. And we have to wrestle with that. What are our expectations of the Messiah? And what is our reaction when we do not get what we thought we wanted? Are we like Peter? Do we rebuke Jesus? And then Jesus' response, "Get behind me, Satan, for your mind is not on divine things, but on human things." That response makes some sense, Because we often want to tell God how life should be, as opposed to trusting that God is the one who knows what's best for us in all things. And kind of the last big point we have here is the cost of discipleship. There's a great book written by a German theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, called The Cost of Discipleship. And when we look at the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we don't get what we expect. And what's even more troubling is that Jesus invites us into that reality. Where does the path of following Jesus lead us to? It leads us to the cross. That's a hard, hard reality. And if you tie that to our expectations of God, does following Jesus to the cross mean that our expectations for God ultimately need to be led to the cross as well? Does God have something new and different in store for us than what we might know? Are we limited in our human capability and the sinful nature that we have to understand and know who God is? Does that all need to go to the cross and follow Jesus so that God can do what God does with suffering and death, and that is bring new life out of it? Difficult questions for us to wrestle with. Now, following Jesus to the cross does not mean that we have to create more suffering for ourselves. It is not a to-do list of everything that we must do to suffer for the sake of Jesus. Because the reality is, life itself is suffering. No one escapes the reality of suffering. Perhaps following Jesus to the cross in this life is a reminder that we can rest assured, as we know in our baptism, that God has not abandoned us. God has not set us to our own to figure out life, to try to create new life. Rather, we can trust that God is at work in the world, not creating suffering for the sake of suffering, but that God is here bringing new life to the suffering we experience as a result of sin. Following Jesus to the cross is a daunting ask for any of us. But as we look at the whole picture of Jesus, we see what God does on the cross. And that is to say that suffering and death do not have the last word in our lives. Even in the midst of all of the terrible things that may have happened to us or that will happen to us. Has God abandoned us? Has God left us here to suffer? Well, when we look to the cross, and as we're reminded in our baptism, the answer is no. God is here doing what God does and what God has always done, and that is to bring about new life in the midst of all things. May we have eyes to see, and ears to hear that this is indeed true. Blessings to you as you take a closer look at this text and as we approach worship this Sunday.